it has been said that I have two alternatives: either go to jail or go to the army. But I would like to say that there is another alternative, and that alternative is justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Muhammad Ali has just refused to be inducted into the United States Armed Forces.
He refused induction on the grounds of his religious convictions on war.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger.
You know, Muhammad Ali is really important in this because when Ali refuses induction, there's a famous column in the New York Times written by Tom Wicker where he just wonders out loud what would happen if you had 100,000 Muhammad Alis. If you had 100,000 people who were prepared to do what Muhammad Ali just did, you would bring this war to a stop. So the draft resistors set that kind of as a goal.
It took an all-white jury less than a half hour to find Muhammad Ali guilty of all charges and specifications. He was sentenced to the maximum, 5 years in prison, and was fined $10,000.
No, I won't be afraid. No, I won't.
I find nothing amusing or interesting or tolerable about this man. He's a disgrace to his country, his race, and what he laughingly describes as his profession. He has been found guilty. He is out on bail. He will inevitably go to prison, as well he should. He's a simplistic fool and a pawn.
Do you share the same concern that Muhammad has for his draft status?
Oh, I certainly do. My views on the draft are very clear. I'm against it. And I think the sooner our country does away with the draft, the better it will be for everybody.
The terms slave patrol and militia were interchangeable and synonymous, literally the same exact thing.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discord of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Currently, what the communists call their Negro Revolutionary Movement, now masquerading behind the humanitarian banners of civil rights, is contributing tremendous momentum to the communist plans to take over the United States.
You tell them white folk in Mississippi that all the scared niggas are dead. We want black power. We want black power.
Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The amendment would also give the federal government the power to enforce that principle.
I heard about Sacramento. I was like, damn, these brothers are bad. They're here up in Sacramento in the capital, packing.
Tear down this wall.
Well, at one point, black people in this country said, hey man, I'm a man. I'm a human being. I'm a woman. I'm a human being. I deserve to eat the same place people eat. I deserve to drink from the same fountain. And out of this grows the civil rights movement, right?
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged to by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. Soon broadened to include schools, many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes. By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests. These included 1955's Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. A watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. Central Park is the starting point for the parade to the UN building. The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns. Makeup and costumes were bizarre. Before the parade, mass draft card burning was urged. Demonstrators claimed 200 cards were burned, but no accurate count could be determined. Reporters and onlookers were jostled away on purpose. Although mostly peaceful, shouted confrontations were frequent and fiery during the course of the march. The anti-war marchers were picketed by anti-war marchers who were hawkish toward the parading doves. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King leads the procession to the United Nations, where he urges UN pressure to force the U.S. to stop bombing North Vietnam. Police arrested 5 persons as disorderly. 3 were grabbed when they rushed the parade float. No serious injuries, however, in New York's biggest anti-war march. A companion peace demonstration brings out 50,000 marchers in downtown San Francisco. They parade 2 miles along Market Street, pacifists and hippies together. Gigantic Kezar Stadium holds the mass rally, where anti-war songs and speeches trigger a short scuffle between pro and con factions. No one was injured. Both demonstrations were sponsored by a loose coalition of left-wing, pacifist, and moderate anti-war groups. President Johnson, meanwhile, let it be known that the FBI is closely watching all anti-war activity. In Rome, a peace demonstration ironically erupts into violence near the U.S. Embassy along the glamorous Via Veneto. Police, alerted to possible trouble, stopped the marchers just short of their goal, and then the march turned into a riot. Peace placards, cafe chairs, and fists flew in all directions. The next phase, a sit-down protest, but Rome police and firemen, too, had a solution. The solution, H2O, applied freely and under high pressure by the Rome Fire Brigade. The strong water jets bowled over demonstrators one after another. They dried out in the pokey. It took police 1 hour to break up the mob. 33 rioters were arrested. Internal drama in the eternal city.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
On June 19, 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death with support from President Lyndon Johnson. The bill struck down existing legislation that allowed for discrimination, and its approval was largely influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington of August 1963.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Capturing the attention of the media and the population, this event attracted hundreds of thousands of people in support of civil rights.
Going into the 50s and 60s, race and the South returned to the forefront of national politics, with the civil rights movement attempting to end segregation and ensure blacks truly have the right to vote. The civil rights debate isn't a purely partisan issue. It's more of a regional issue, with Northerners from both parties supporting it and Southerners from both parties opposing it. Then, in 1964, it's Democratic President Lyndon Johnson who signs the Civil Rights Act into law. And it's Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater who opposes it, arguing that it expands government power too much. A massive switch-up takes place. Black voters, some of whom had already been shifting from the Republican Party, convert almost entirely to their new advocates, the Democrats. The white voters in the South, who had been staunch Democrats, start to really resent the big government interference here and in other matters like abortion rights and school prayer. Over the next 3 decades, whites in the South switch to the GOP, which makes the South an overwhelmingly Republican region.
And what you see the second that the Martin Luther King and then and amazing figures like Malcolm X come out of this, right, and start to demand power and equality for Black Americans. Well, the Klan, rears its head, and the John Birch Society, and they come out and they push all this garbage, which will be relevant. You'll see when we get more into what's happening in modern times. But they push out these talking points that, like I said, from the John Birch Society and from the Klan, that outside agitating Marxists are influencing Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and, stirring up what are otherwise very peaceful, good black people. They didn't call them black people. They use that N-word with hard R, our good N-words that, normally don't cause nobody no trouble, getting all stirred up by these outside agitating Marxists.
Each week, American History TV's Real America brings you archival films that provide context for today's public affairs issues. Anarchy USA is an anti-communism film produced at the height of the Cold War by the John Birch Society. The film uses narration and news footage to detail the methods of communist revolutionaries in China, Algeria, and Cuba, and then argues that U.S. civil rights leaders are also communists using the same methods. The film condemns several U.S. presidents and the 1964 Civil Rights and 1965 Voting Rights Acts.
Anarchy, the breakdown of law and order, a chaotic reign of terror, mob rule and rioting, the collapse of government authority. These phrases ring strange in the ears of Americans, and for good reason. Through the years, America has stood as the world symbol for law and order. Our government is responsive to the will of the people. Our courts and legislatures provide the mechanics for a peaceful redress of grievances. And the policeman on the corner has traditionally been looked upon as a friend, not as the instrument of a tyrant. Anarchy, well, that was something we read about in our newspapers that was always happening in other countries. Perhaps the people in other countries had just reasons to riot against their governments. After all, many of the nations of the world are dictatorships in one form or another. What business was it of ours, anyway? Newsworthy, perhaps, but it could never happen here. Then, in the summer of 1964, widespread rioting and looting suddenly broke out in Harlem, in Rochester, in Newark, in Jersey City, in Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Chicago, all within a few days of each other. It was as though an unseen hand had given the signal. Then, on August 18th, 1965, guns replaced nightsticks in the hands of law enforcement officers as the Watts area of Los Angeles literally burst into a cauldron of insurrection. Thousands of rioters roamed the streets both night and day, smashing and looting, and setting the torch to over 50 square miles of the city. Hidden snipers held police and firefighters at bay as fires raged unabated. At least 35 Americans died in the violence and gunfire. The sheer magnitude of this monstrous madness strained the abilities of the civil authorities, and the California National Guard was sent to Watts with orders to quell the violence with brute force if necessary. The spectacle of American soldiers shooting it out with American civilians was even more shocking than the rioting itself. The nation was stunned and horrified. No smugness now. This time, it wasn't a foreign country. This time, it was Anarchy USA. The degree of communist influence in these riots has been subject of much discussion and controversy. For a solution to this controversy, let's review the events of recent years, both at home and abroad, in light of the communists' own plans for world conquest. For Mao Zedong, a new regime promised reforms, but the communists were not interested in reform. They were dedicated to revolution. Fidel Castro, a young, well-trained communist revolutionary with much experience, seized upon the issue of corruption in government as he undertook the creation of his revolution. This they do by hiding the true communist objectives behind appealing slogans and pretended humanitarian goals. As Stalin explained,
the revolutionary accepts reform in order to use it as a cover for his illegal work.
Mao Zedong exclaimed, "We are not striving for the social and political communism of Russia. Rather, we prefer to think of what we are doing as something Lincoln fought for in the Civil War, the liberation of slaves." In the United States, those books which praised Mao Zedong as non-communist and an agrarian reformer were advocated reading, and some even became book club selections. Men, women, and even children came under this merciless scourge in the name of freedom. These cities, and the cities which lie within their spheres of influence, became known in communist writings as the Black Belt of the South, and were to constitute the nucleus of a future Soviet republic.
If all goes according to the communist blueprint, Americans will believe that the chaos and violence has something to do with civil rights. Our enemies were quick to find our weakest point for their attack. They knew that racial differences could provide them with an excellent wedge to divide our people.
Which just stirs up all the white people and then tells white people, so you're under threat. They're coming, they want to let all of these Marxists want these black people to attack you and come rape your women. So they come out and they just start violently murdering black people on the street, and any black person is the one person that either did or didn't maybe get accused at the very least of raping someone, and you know, the lynchings across the country. And so in the face of when they escalate the violence against the black community for daring to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we deserve to be equal like everybody else. Of course, the white racist infrastructure that was built on slavery and slave patrol militias in the Second Amendment and the 13th Amendment exception clause that allows the ownership of other people and the profit generated by the ownership of those people to continue. Well, all of that senses danger, senses itself at risk in the face of black people standing up to that and going, hey, wait a minute, this is a systemically racist country, and we're just as much human beings and have just as right to the fruits of this supposed free fucking country as anybody else. Well, this gives rise, this soup, the violent response to black people peacefully marching in the street and taking the batons and taking the arrests and getting arrested time after time after time. Having the fire hoses opened up on them time after time, having the dogs let loose on them time after time. In the face of all that brutality comes the Black Power movement. And that's what we're going to tackle in the next section when we take a good hard look at the 70s. Because the 1970s then, of course, gives way to a very pivotal moment in the 80s and the 90s, which then gives way to the Obama era, which results in the Trump era, which gets us to a 17-year-old kid grabbing up his fucking rifle, driving across state lines and murdering people because he thinks he's God's fucking gift to heroism and the American fucking way. Well, as it turns out, in a lot of ways, on that last part, he's right. And that's what we're looking at today on the sort of P for P's people's history, right? Anyway, check out this video, and we'll be right back with the 1970s Black Power struggle.
We have to go to the root. We have to go to the cause. Dealing with the condition itself is not enough. And it is because of our effort toward getting straight to the root that people oftentimes think we are dealing in hate. We are oppressed. We are exploited. We are downtrodden. We are denied not only civil rights, but even human rights. So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy. You should ask yourself who taught you to hate being what God gave you. If he were made to realize how black people really feel and how fed up we are without that old compromise and sweet talk. Stop sweet talking. Tell him how you feel. Tell him what kind of hell you've been catching, and let him know that if he's not ready to clean his house up, if he's not ready to clean his house up, he shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down.
With the last words on my lips, that I am a revolutionary. And you're gonna have to keep on saying that. You're gonna have to say that I am a proletarian. I am the people. I'm not the pig. You've got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the pig. The people are going to have to stand up against the pig. That's what the pastors are doing here. That's what the pastors are doing all over the world. That you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution. Right. You might run a liberator like Aaron Cleave out the country, but you can't run liberation out the country. You might murder a freedom fighter like Bobby Hutton, but you can't murder freedom fighting. And if you do, you come up with answers that don't answer, explanations that don't explain. You come up with conclusions that don't conclude.
about Sacramento, I was like, damn, these brothers are bad. They're here up in Sacramento in the capital, packing.